instead of one. Scripture reading, because this has something to do with what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 5. It says there in Proverbs chapter 4, keep my commands, he taught me and said, your heart must hold on to my words. Keep my commands and live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget or turn away from the word of my mouth. Do not abandon wisdom, and she will watch over you. Love her, and she will guard you. Wisdom is supreme. Get wisdom, and whatever else you get understanding. Now, the irony here is that we're about to talk about wisdom this morning, and my parents are right there. And they're probably saying, what in the world is he doing talking about wisdom? Because they know me better than a lot of people. And so all of us have those moments and times in life where we didn't act very wise. I don't know if I've shared this story with you or not, but there was a time, how old was I, Mom, when we had the plastic golf club incident? I was 5 years old, and I was outside. My father did one of the best things that he could have ever done for me, which was introduce me to the great game of golf. And I wanted to practice my swing. This is not going to end well, just letting you know. If you're hoping for happily ever after, not this story. And so I noticed down the driveway of our house these white things that looked like golf balls. I would later come to find out that these were Mom's freshly planted tulips. And I figured that if I was gonna, and I'm embellishing just a little bit, but I figured, you know what, if I'm gonna make it to the PGA Tour, I gotta, practice every day. And I didn't see a white golf ball anywhere, but I saw something that looked like it right down the road. And so I managed, and I was 1,000%, I hit every one of them right down the fairway. I don't do that today, but I hacked every single one of those white tulips to the ground with my plastic golf club. And then I ran back to the house, knocked on the door, and said, Mom, I hit all the golf balls. Yeah. And then she proceeded to get mad, and I proceeded to run, compounding my situation, in which I made the mistake of going down the hallway instead of running around the main part of the house. Went down the hallway, and the only thing that you can do in the hallway is go left into the first bedroom, right into the bathroom, left into our room, right into Mom and Dad's room, or right there at the closet where the vacuum was. Trapped. That's what that was. And she did what she was supposed to do as a fine New York woman. She gave me a spanking, which I deserved. And told me never to do it again, and I didn't do it again. Another instance of wisdom, when we thought that we were helping out Mom and Dad, this is one of those things where both brothers are caught hook, line, and sinker. It was a cold day outside, and in Virginia, much like North Carolina, if there's a little bit of snow, everything shuts down. Once everybody hears that snow's coming, milk, bread, gone. And so, Mom, what kind of car was it? Green Pontiac. There it was. There you go. Green Pontiac. And so nothing but ice everywhere. And so we know that at some point, Mom's going to want to use the car. And that Mom's want to go out and get something for the family so that we don't have to starve to death. It's an inch of ice, right? And so my brother and I, oh man, memories. See, when I share this with you, you're going to be like, man, he's come a long way. We got 2 plastic baseball bats and proceeded to beat the ice off the car because we didn't want the car to be full of ice. Something like 20 dents in the side of the car. Needless to say, we managed to accomplish the mission of getting the ice off the car But that was a hefty bill to get all those dents out. And Mom, and I don't know if Dad did or not, but Mom is a good New York woman, gave us a spanking. Some other events that might have taken place that I might not have shared with you. When I was in boot camp down in Paris Island, there was an instance where I thought that I could get away with breaking the rules. I guess I just lost track of where I actually was. Paris Island, drill instructors, Marine Corps, probably should have set off some alarms, right? But it was in the middle of the night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And at the time, there were designated times during the day where you could write a letter home. And that's the only time that you could write a letter home. Well, I didn't like that time. So I was laying on the top rack. I went down quietly, unlocked my foot locker. I mean, Tom Cruise from Mission Impossible would have been proud. James Bond had nothing on me at that moment, right? Unlocked the foot locker, got out the writing gear, got out the pen, aka ink stick, right? Some of y'all remember that. You remember that? And proceeded to write a letter home to the girl that I was dating at the time. I was almost done. I could see the finish line. And then, out of nowhere, hand came up, snatched everything. I mean, it was quick. Quick. Usain Bolt's got nothing on this guy. Drill instructor Sergeant Orduno, who's about 5 foot nothing and mean as a pit bull, snatched it out and just looked at me and said, in a whisper, like yell, "Come here." And I was like, I'm dead. And so he pulled me down, he took me up to the quarterdeck, and he said, "Wait right here." And I didn't know what he was going to do. I didn't know whether he's going to go find a body bag. I didn't know if he was finding a coffin. I didn't know if he's going to go get other drill instructors to pile on me at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I waited there for what seemed like an eternity. And he came back with two buckets of, two trash cans, not buckets, 2 trash cans full of soap water. And he went, "Shh, shh." And he handed me a towel and a brush and said, "It's up by morning or you're dead." And I'm not talking like one of the long towels. I'm talking one that's like this long. So what's he want me to do? He wants me to get down, scrub it, and wipe it up. All by the time that we wake up, which was 2.5 hours later. And at that moment, look at hindsight's 2020. At that moment, I probably should have registered in my mind that this relationship that I was in probably wasn't going to work out, since it cost me so much pain at that moment, right? Just instances in my own life of not being very wise. And you guys have found some humor in that. I'm glad that you have. Most of that stuff, or all of those things, was painful for me in one way, shape, or the other. But here's the thing. Isn't it interesting that no matter how many times we find ourselves in predicaments in which we would classify, looking back, that was unwise. Isn't it interesting that people in general have a tendency to repeat, real quick, is Kelsey in the room? She's right there? Okay. Have a tendency to repeat the not smart things that they do. I'm avoiding a word for Kelsey, right? The not smart things that they do. And then we get into the position after we repeat all of the not smart things that we do, we say, how did that happen? And why does it keep happening? I mean, my dad's probably over there like, why does it keep happening? No. Love you, man. And so what the proverb talks about is the value of wisdom. And that leads to another question. What in the world is biblical wisdom. Because whether you know it or not, there's a difference, a huge difference between worldly wisdom and biblical wisdom. Huge difference. And Paul in the book of Ephesus he's dealing with two groups of people from two different ethnic backgrounds and a conglomerate of people from different backgrounds in general, different economic positions, maybe even some different political positions. But they are struggling to get along in the book of Ephesus because they've always done or always believed and always acted the same way until Jesus Christ came into their life. And so the tension that's in the book of Ephesus is the fact that one group of people believes that they have the monopoly on wisdom, and the other group of people believes that they've got the monopoly on wisdom. And Paul says, neither one of you got monopoly on wisdom. And isn't it interesting that as we survey our country, and maybe even as we survey our lives, the one thing that's always neglected in how to handle situations and circumstances that we face is this question: what does wisdom require here? You ever thought about that? I mean, how many conversations do we have with people in which they're telling us about their circumstance and situation, and that question comes up? What does wisdom require here? Most of us, and I would maybe even gauge, maybe all of us, rarely ask that question in conversations. And why is that? And what's the result of that? What are some pitfalls of neglecting wisdom? Now, before we even get into Ephesians chapter 5, when we look at this thing called wisdom, first we have to ask, what is it? And from a biblical perspective, James lays it out. In the entire book of James, we're not going to move through that now, but biblical wisdom is the ability to see earthly situations and circumstances through a heavenly lens. The ability to see earthly situations and circumstances through a heavenly lens. Now that's the foundation for it. Now, notice that's a lot different than the way the world looks at wisdom. For most people, wisdom is just the equivalence of being really smart. You know, and I'm not trying to brag on myself here. Well, maybe I am. Okay, I will. I would consider myself a decently intelligent person. I'll say decent. I know Brent's over there like, you can't be too smart, you're a Marine. And I know he is, Army dog, it happens. But haven't you noticed that sometimes you interact with a lot of smart people who aren't very wise? I mean, think about it for a second. How many athletes, celebrities, politicians, or even some tech giants, I mean, the people that used to run Enron, if some of y'all remember that, really smart people because they had a brilliant concept for a company at its foundational level. But they were really not smart in the way in which they tried to manipulate and use corruption to gain everything that they wanted. So here's the thing about wisdom. You can be really smart. You can be an Einstein and still not be wise. That's the truth. And worldly wisdom says this, that worldly wisdom is this. Here it is. What I want and how I get there is always wise. What I want and how I get there is always the right thing to do, is always the wise thing to do. Do you see the contrast, the difference between those things? On one hand, wisdom is centrally focused in the needs, wants, and desires of the individual person. While on the other hand, wisdom is grounded in the application of what God has given us through His Word. Because sometimes what God says is wise, I'm going to completely and totally disagree with. I'll give you an example. Love your enemies and pray for them. Most people would say, not in my lane of wisdom. But God says, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, that's the wise thing to do. Another one, go the extra mile for your enemy. Most people would say, probably shouldn't give them a cup of water if they were thirsty on the side of the road. That would be wise for me to do that. Well, that's not what God says. And so this is what God says in Ephesians chapter 5. And this is how wisdom, heavenly wisdom, biblical wisdom, operates in your life. It serves as a guardrail. See, the interesting thing about guardrails is this. You don't really want a guardrail. You don't really think about a guardrail. You don't really care about a guardrail until you need one. You just don't. I mean, think about all of the accidents that you've seen as you're riding down the interstate. And how many of those accidents, while they are really bad, could have been much worse if the guardrail wasn't in place. And here's the problem that we might see with some life guardrails, is that guardrails always occupy some of the safe space in order to prevent further damage. And here's the thing about you and me, and here's the thing about culture. I want all of my space. I don't want anything to occupy my space. I don't want anything to relegate or determine how far or where I can go. Because guardrails impede some freedom of movement of the vehicle in order to make sure that further damage doesn't take place. And so many people in the culture and so many people in the world, and I would even say some people maybe even here this morning, believe that they are entitled to do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, under any circumstance. And that the idea of a guardrail, the idea of biblical wisdom, might be a good concept, but really doesn't fit where they want their life to go. And know what else guardrails do? They direct us. They not only protect us, but they also direct us. Have you ever been? We went up to the mountains a couple weeks ago, and I can tell you, as we started climbing this mountain, I was so happy that there was it wasn't much of a guardrail. It was a wooden guardrail. But I'm glad it was there, because it protected us from, if we were to hit it, it would protect us from going over the side of the cliff. And that's what God's wisdom does. It not only directs us, it also protects us. And this is what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5. He says that this wisdom directs us and it protects us. Notice in Ephesians chapter 5, and I don't know why I am in 1 Peter. That is not Ephesians. And so he says in chapter 5, notice what he says in verse 15. Now, he's already talked about the need and the want and the desire for the people there at Ephesus, regardless of Jew, Gentile, regardless of background, regardless of circumstance or situation. He wants those people to live or walk a certain way. The word walk there, that's used throughout the book of Ephesians, literally means a manner of lifestyle. And so he says in verse 15, pay careful, pay close, examine carefully, I don't know what your translation says, then how you walk or how you live. If I'm going to understand biblical wisdom and I'm going to allow biblical wisdom to direct me and also to protect me as my spiritual guardrail, one of the things that I have to do is I have to pay close attention to how I'm living. Now, what's the standard operating procedure for our lives? Our standard operating procedure for our lives is not to pay close attention to how I live, but examine everybody else. Right? I go around and I look at somebody over here and I say, you know what? It even happens in the church. You know, that sister over there, she'd be a lot better if she did this. That brother over there, he'd be a lot better if he did this. And you know, those kids over there, they'd be a lot better if their parents would just do that. And that elder and the preachers and the deacons and everybody else this is how they need to operate. And the entire time, there's never once the position of, maybe it's not them. Maybe instead of paying close attention to how everybody else is living, the first thing I need to do is pay attention to how I'm living. Because, you know, Jesus said something about a speck and a plank back in Matthew chapter 7, right? And that's sometimes what prevents us from, you know, completely understanding or taking into account God's wisdom for my life, is when I'm so overbearing and so overcorrective of everybody else's life. And why is that? Because maybe what I understand is that if I look at this book and if I pay close attention to my life, I got to do something difficult. You ready? This is deep and this is theological. I might be wrong. I might be living outside of the parameters of God's wisdom. I might have some issues that I need to bring to the surface and handle before everybody else. And that impacts families. I mean, see, here's the thing about even in the family. We're talking about our new series, Redeeming the Family. If I'm as a husband, or even if I, just as a normal Christian person, if I am constantly worried about how everybody else is living and I'm trying to put out everybody else's fire, what happens when there's some smoke in my house? What happens when my marriage catches on fire and I'm not there to put it out because I'm worried about everybody else? See, that's why Paul says to both the Jew and the Gentile in Ephesians chapter 5, pay careful attention. It is not a skimming of the surface, but it is an objective, deep look into the way in which one acts, which one thinks, and what one says. Because whether you know it or not, whether you believe it or not, whether you want to, come to grips with it or not, or whether I want to come to grips with it or not, what we do and what we say and how we act impacts not just me. It impacts everybody around me. Think about it for a second. What would you do if someone said, hey, I'm going to give you this grenade. And this is what I need you to do with this grenade. I need you to make sure that this grenade is to standard of United States military protocol. And then you take that grenade and you don't pay any attention to it. You don't inspect it. You don't look at it. You don't, go by, you don't see, the standard operating procedure manual for how a grenade should be put together or how a grenade should function. And you just say, well, I got other stuff. I got better stuff to do. Here, just take it back. I guess it's all good. You know what the potential there is that somebody who's going to come across that grenade, they're going to think it operates one way and it's going to end up blowing up right in their face. And that's what can happen to our lives if we're not careful and we don't pay attention to it. If we don't utilize the wisdom of God, the ability to see earthly circumstances through a heavenly lens, we'll think that we're acting wisely, but in all actuality, we are on the path and on the verge of self destruction, of family destruction. And we won't learn. We'll get into the vicious cycle of doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we will expect a different result. And Einstein said, that's insanity. Notice what else he says. Why pay close attention? Why do what he's saying here? Notice in the very next verse, it states, pay careful attention in how you live, not as unwise. Some translations say not as foolish people, but as wise people, making most of the time. Or some say redeeming the time. See, here's the thing about your life and about my life. All the stuff that happened 5 years ago, all the things that happened 25 years ago, Mom, I can't replace them tulips. I can't go back and fix the dents in the car. I can't go back and say, you know what, I really shouldn't be writing this letter home. I can't do that. I can't obsess over that. I can't occupy my current position regarding all of that. The only thing that I can do is pay careful attention to how I'm living now, utilize the wisdom of God, and make the most of what I've got now. Because when it comes to God's wisdom and when it comes to our time, time is the most valuable commodity because we can never have enough of it. And the one reason why people don't utilize the wisdom of God, one reason why people aren't able in their current situation to take their current circumstance and look through it with heavenly lenses is because they're so fixated on all the stuff that happened back here. They're worried about the guilt that's associated with A, B, C, or D in the past. And so they get to the point where they say, you know what? I'm just never going to be wise. I'm just never going to be a good person because of all this stuff that took place here. But what Paul says is that in our day and age, in our lives, in our families, in our relationships, at work, with our friends, that if we act as wise people, I don't have to bear the guilt and the shame of the past, but I can redeem my current situation and circumstance. And that is a gift. And that is a blessing that so many people in the world either fail to acknowledge or don't know about. And he says that we need to pay attention to the time and we need to redeem the time because the days are evil. And this is one of the things that we take for granted. And this is one of the things that we sometimes don't concentrate on. That the guardrails that God has set in place through his wisdom are not there to be a killjoy. Sometimes we look at some of the things that God says and say, well, I could never do that and that would never be fun. Can I just be blunt with you this morning? God's primary concern is not whether or not his guardrails are fun, but they are there so that you might experience all that he has to offer in and of himself through the application of his wisdom. And so it's not just necessarily a matter of, well, that doesn't seem fun or that might be a killjoy. But if we understand God's wisdom, we understand that God has our best spiritual interest at hand, then we can also understand that those guardrails are there because he wants us to experience abundant and eternal life with him. That his wisdom and those guardrails are there not only to direct us, but also to protect us. And then he gives an analogy. He uses an example of one thing that can lead to another. And he says in verse 18, he gives an example. And don't get drunk with wine, which leads to debauchery or is debauchery or leads to reckless living. And so one of the commands that he gives here to the people at Ephesus, both Jew and Greek, at a port city in Rome that I'm sure was probably equivalent in most of those places as a party hub. He says, hey, here's God's wisdom. Here's how you can measure, or here's one of the instances where you can measure and pay close attention to how you're living. Don't get drunk. Because what that's going to do, if you get drunk, what that's going to do is you're going to make an exchange. You're going to exchange your freedom. You're going to exchange your ability to think soberly. You're going to exchange your ability to act wisely, and you're going to place that into the hands of something or someone. So the guardrail is, hey, don't get drunk, because it will lead to you being reckless with your life. And if you're reckless with your life, there will come a point where you are shameful, where you are guilty because of something that you did, because you allowed someone or something to take control of you. Specifically here, wine. And so he gives the alternative to that. Notice God's wisdom here. He takes what would make somebody reckless and he says, if you're going to fill yourself with anything, why has it got to be wine? Why has it got to be something or someone? Why can't it be the Holy Spirit? Instead of taking your time and wasting your time and filling yourself with something that can only lead to a reckless life, why not fill yourself with something that can lead to a redeemed, holy, joyous life? And instead of placing yourself and your freedom and your life in the hands of something or someone that's reckless, why not spend that time, notice what he says, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, singing, making music with your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another in the fear of the Lord. See, Paul says that's wisdom in action. Previously in the chapter, he said, be an imitator of God and don't allow the people who operate in dark, don't partner with them. In chapter 2, he notes to the Gentiles that they once lived in the transgressions of their sin, but now they are something completely and totally different. And here's the thing, and here's the practical application for you, your family, and for anybody else that's here this morning, is that you can't have the wisdom of the world and try and pair it with the wisdom of God, because the two are like mixing oil and water. They don't go together. Apples and oranges. And so many people, whether we see it on the TV, whether we hear about it on the radio, or whether we experience in our own life, find themselves in a cycle of destruction, professionally, relationally, and spiritually. Because at the epicenter, at the nexus of how they operate is self. Is desire. is need. Is I'm going to do what I want, when I want, how I want, with who I want. And maybe this morning, you've been living a life that's been completely unwise for at least recent history. Or maybe this morning, you're sitting here this morning and you're saying, you know what? I find myself in this cycle and I don't know why I keep doing the things that I'm doing. I want to be better, but I just don't know how. Maybe it's because you've misunderstood the definition of real wisdom. And if we're going to redeem our families, and if the family is once again going to be the epicenter of culture, and if family is what's going to drive the growth of the New Testament church, then no longer can we each individually operate on our own subjective definition of wisdom. We have to view wisdom the way that the Bible views wisdom. And we can't be scared to operate within God's guardrails. Because his guardrails direct us and protect us. I can remember several years ago as I was riding to Statesville at night. I had just gotten to Lake Norman. I was staying with a family. And it was foggy. And I made an unwise decision. I decided that I was going to go ahead and text and drive. And as I'm texting and driving in the fog, my phone drops. And because I was so concerned about what was going to happen on that phone, I reached down to pick it up, and as I did that, I swerved into the right lane. And then I overcorrected, and I hit a Mustang, and then I overcorrected again, and I was going towards Lake Norman, like I was going to be in it. Until I smashed into a guardrail. I never thought about a guardrail. Never thought about the construction of a guardrail. Never thought about the protection of a guardrail. Never thought about the direction of a guardrail. Until I got out of that car. See, you don't need a guardrail till you do. And God's got the perfect guardrails for your life because he operates off of his wisdom. This morning, would you consider his guardrails and operating on his wisdom? So if you're having family strife, if you're having marriage issues, maybe what we need to do is instead of trying to subjectively figure out on our own what's going on or what's the problem, maybe we just need to read Ephesians chapter 5 or 1 Peter chapter 3 or Matthew chapter 19 or Genesis chapter 3, which outlines the guardrails for marriage. Maybe I'm struggling with an enemy, and we can outline and look at that guardrail as well. Or maybe I'm struggling as being a steward with my own finances. Well, guess what? The Bible speaks to that as well. Or maybe there's some other sin that I'm worried about, that I'm concentrating on, that I've suppressed and pushed under the rug, that needs to be brought to the surface and dealt with in the manner in which is inside of God's guardrails. Maybe we need to stop worrying about how everybody else is living and take some time to concentrate and carefully examine our own lives. So here's the application question, and then we're done. Here it is. If I'm honest with myself, given the definition of God's or the Bible's definition of wisdom, am I wise? if I'm honest with myself, given the Bible's definition of wisdom, am I wise? Because the answer to that question determines whether or not you've been operating inside the guardrails or you're on the verge of falling over the cliff. Remember, God's wisdom, his guardrails, are there to direct us and protect us. And there's no better place than here, no better time than right now. For us as a family, for us as brothers and sisters and Christians who are beggars who have found the bread of life, to make that stuff known. Whether it's here by coming forward this morning, or whether it's pulling a brother or a sister or a trusted confidant aside, to have a conversation, to operate on wisdom. And if we do that, we'll find ourselves in a lot less trouble. We'll find ourselves with a lot less regrets, but we'll also find ourselves a lot closer to God. And if that's something you desire, please take care of that as soon as possible. And maybe even now, as we stand and as we sing.